But God had a plan. God took Jesus out of this world into heaven and disguised someone else to make him look like Jesus. And this other person was crucified. This is called substitution theory, the belief that Jesus was replaced by a substitute. There are numerous problems with this theory. Let's consider 4. First, substitution theory portrays Allah as a malicious deceiver. If Jesus didn't actually die, but Allah made people think that Jesus died, the real reason billions of people are now convinced that Jesus died by crucifixion is that Allah did an amazing job tricking everyone.
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I've stumbled across this video and oh man, this one is absolutely fire. We've got Dr. David Wood, one of the most well-known Christian apologists out there, going head-to-head with Dr. Shabir Ali, a Muslim scholar and president of the Islamic Information and Dawah Center, debating the question, did Jesus actually rise from the dead? And let me tell you, David Wood does not hold back in this one. He goes straight at the Islamic position and calls it out for what he believes are massive contradictions. And the moment where he says the Islamic view makes Jesus a failure and that Allah basically sabotaged his own prophet, you're going to want to see how that unfolds. So make sure you watch until the end, and please comment down below where you're watching from. I really love to see people from all over the world connecting in here. Alright, now let's get into the video.
So we can't attribute the resurrection appearances to legend or to hallucinations. Can we attribute them to deception? Were the disciples lying about the appearances? That's what I thought before I was a Christian, but there's a fatal flaw in the deception hypothesis. Liars make poor martyrs. Some human beings will die for what they believe in. I've never met anyone who's willing to die for something he made up. In the book of Acts, chapter 4, Peter and John are arrested and threatened. In Acts 5, the apostles are put in jail and flogged. In Acts 12, James, the brother of John, is put to death by Herod, and Peter is again put in jail. The apostle Paul describes his life as a Christian in 2 Corinthians 11, 24 to 27. He writes, 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have spent in the deep. I've been on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among false brethren. I've been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. Become an apostle, it's a great life. Jewish historian Josephus reports that James, the brother of Jesus, was stoned to death as a lawbreaker. Clement of Rome invites his readers to keep in mind the sufferings and martyrdoms of Peter and Paul. So the apostles didn't just preach that they had seen Jesus alive again, they were willing to endure prison, floggings, and death as they preached, and that means they really believed what they were saying. Here again, it's not just Christians who draw this conclusion. Even non-Christians maintain that the disciples sincerely believed that they had seen the risen Jesus. Gerrit Ludemann, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Bart Ehrman, we can say with complete certainty that some of his disciples at some later time insisted that he soon appeared to them, convincing them that he had been raised from the dead. Paula Fredrickson, I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw. But I do know, as a historian, that they must have seen something. Fredrickson says she doesn't know what they saw. But I do. They saw the sort of thing that would convince individuals and groups, friends and foes, that they had all seen a man who had once been dead standing before them. And I've never seen an explanation that accounts for this apart from the resurrection. That's the Christian perspective, but this debate is about Christian and Muslim perspectives. So I'll briefly address the most common Muslim account of what happened to Jesus. According to the traditional Muslim position, Jesus went around telling people to believe in God and in the Torah, and for some reason this upset the Jews so much that they decided to kill him. But God had a plan. God took Jesus out of this world into heaven and disguised someone else to make him look like Jesus. And this other person was crucified. This is called substitution theory, the belief that Jesus was replaced by a substitute. There are numerous problems with this theory. Let's consider 4. First, substitution theory portrays Allah as a malicious deceiver. If Jesus didn't actually die, but Allah made people think that Jesus died, the real reason billions of people are now convinced that Jesus died by crucifixion is that Allah did an amazing job tricking everyone. Second, the Islamic view portrays Jesus as a failure. The Jesus of the Quran spent years preaching Islam, only to have his life's work sabotaged by Allah, who convinced the world that Jesus died by crucifixion, ultimately giving rise to Christianity.
This is the argument that honestly nobody can get around. And I need you to really sit with what David Wood just laid out here. Because this is one of those moments where if you are paying attention, you realize the entire conversation just shifted. He makes this incredibly simple but devastating point. He said, liars make poor martyrs. And that line alone should make everyone stop and think. Because here is what we know historically. We know that the disciples of Jesus did not just go around telling people a nice story. These men faced persecution. They were imprisoned. They were executed for their beliefs. We have documented historical accounts of what happened to these people. Peter, Paul, James, Thomas, and the other apostles all met violent ends according to historical records. These accounts come from multiple sources, including non-Christian historians. These are not legends. These are not fairy tales made up centuries later. We have documentation of their fates from credible ancient sources. So here is the question that I need the skeptics to answer. Why would these men endure persecution and death for something they knew was a lie? Think about it. If they were the ones who made up the resurrection story, they would know it was fake. And yet every single one of them refused to recant even when facing execution. That does not happen with liars. Liars break under pressure. Liars save themselves when their life is on the line. And then David addresses the Islamic position directly. He raises a serious theological concern about the substitution theory. And his point is worth considering because think about what that theology requires you to believe. It requires you to believe that the disciples themselves were allowed to believe something false about what happened to Jesus. That everyone who witnessed the event came away with an incorrect understanding. And then the second point hits even harder. He said the Islamic view creates a problem for Jesus' mission. The Quran says Jesus preached submission to God. But if that is true, where are the followers of that specific message from the first century? Where are the documents? Where is the evidence? There is nothing in the historical record. Christianity exploded across the Roman Empire, while this supposed original message of Jesus has no traceable historical footprint.
According to the Quran, Jesus' followers were devout Muslims, but they must have disappeared rather quickly, without so much as a whimper, because we have no records that they even existed. So the Islamic Jesus couldn't win a single lasting convert, and he accomplished absolutely nothing of any lasting significance. Third, Surah 61 verse 14 of the Quran claims that Allah aided the true followers of Jesus until they became uppermost over those who rejected Jesus. But the followers of Jesus who became uppermost over those who opposed Jesus were Christians who proclaimed Jesus' death and resurrection. If Jesus didn't die and rise from the dead, then the Quran is false. Fourth, Surah 7 verse 157 of the Quran says that Christians were still reading the gospel during the time of Muhammad, and Surah 5 verse 47 of the Quran commands Christians to judge by the gospel. Since we know that the gospel, read by Christians in the 7th century, affirmed Jesus' death and resurrection, Muslims are contradicting the Quran when they say that Jesus didn't die or rise from the dead. So the Islamic view not only flies in the face of history and scholarship, but also insults God, insults Jesus, and contradicts the Quran. The Christian view, by contrast, honors God, honors Jesus, and is thoroughly grounded in historical facts and careful scholarship. If we agree with David Hume that a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence, we should all confess that Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead, just as he said he would.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because David doesn't just stop at making the argument. He goes directly to the Quran itself to prove his point. And this is what I love about this approach. He's not just saying the Christian view is right. He's showing that the Islamic view contradicts its own scripture. He points to Surah 61 verse 14, which says that Allah aided the true followers of Jesus until they became uppermost. Did you catch that? Uppermost. The Quran itself says the true followers of Jesus would win. They would become dominant. They would be victorious over those who rejected Jesus. So let me ask the obvious question. Who became uppermost in history? Who spread across the entire Roman Empire? Who became the dominant faith for 2,000 years? Christians. Christians who believed Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead. If they weren't the true followers of Jesus, according to the Quran's own standard, then who was? Because there's no historical record of any other group. And then he brings up another devastating point. The Quran in Surah 5 verse 47 commands Christians to judge by the gospel. But the gospel that existed in the 7th century when the Quran was written is the same gospel we have today. And that gospel clearly teaches that Jesus died by crucifixion and rose again. So if Christians are supposed to judge by the gospel, and the gospel says Jesus died and rose, then the Quran is actually confirming the Christian position. David summarizes it perfectly. He said, the Islamic view flies in the face of history, insults God, insults Jesus, and contradicts the Quran. That's not an exaggeration. That's just following the evidence and the texts to their logical conclusion. You cannot hold the Islamic position on Jesus without creating massive contradictions in your own scripture.
Hello again. I begin by praising our Creator and Fashioner, the Creator of the heavens and the earth, asking him to send peace and blessings upon all of his prophets, his messengers, all of the righteous people and saints of all time, on all of us here tonight, our loved ones, our families, and ask him to send peace and prosperity in the world around us. I want to start by giving thanks to not only God, but to all of the people who have made it possible for us to be here tonight. The list, as you know, is very long, so I just second what Amos said before me, and thank all of the people that he already thanked, and also some of the people who have been making life for me comfortable since I got here, picking me up from the airport and so on. So as for the topic tonight, David has given you a very good overview of the Christian position, and he also intimated something about the Muslim position. And that is a reasonable place for me to start at, the Muslim position. I'd like to introduce to you a book by Tarif Khalidi, a Cambridge scholar, a book entitled The Muslim Jesus. And in that book, Tarif Khalidi summarized what we know from the Quran on the whole. He said that in denying the crucifixion, the Quran is in fact denying that the Jews killed him. So that is in a nutshell. Now, if you go into details about that, then we visit the verse, Surah 4, verse 157, where it says that the Jews were claiming, we killed the Messiah, Jesus. And in response to that, the Quran is saying, they killed him not, and they did not crucify him. Now, Muslim scholars have generally taken these to be two things being denied. On the one hand, the Quran is saying, they said, that the Jews did not kill Jesus. And on the other hand, according to them, the Quran is denying that Jesus was ever put on the cross. Here they take crucifixion in its most absolute meaning. Let me backtrack for a moment and say that crucifixion is an ambiguous term, just as the word hanging is in English.
Now we get to hear the response. And I want to be fair here. Shabir Ali is a well-educated man. He's done his research. He knows the texts. But watch what happens when he tries to respond to these arguments. He starts by acknowledging that David gave a very good overview of the Christian position, and I appreciate the honesty there. But then he tries to reframe what the Quran actually says about the crucifixion. He references a scholar named named Tarif Khalidi, who says that the Quran is actually just denying that the Jews killed Jesus, not that Jesus didn't die at all. And here's where I need you to understand something about Islamic scholarship that most people don't realize. There is no unified position on what happened to Jesus. Muslims have been debating this for over 1,000 years. Some say Jesus was replaced by someone who looked like him. Some say Judas was crucified instead. Some say it was a Roman soldier. Some modern Muslims are now saying Jesus actually did die on the cross, but it wasn't the Jews who really killed him. The fact that there's this much disagreement tells you something important. It tells you that the Quranic text on this issue is incredibly vague. And when your foundational text is vague on one of the most important events in religious history, that's a problem. Compare that to the New Testament, which has multiple detailed accounts from eyewitnesses, and people who knew eyewitnesses all saying the exact same thing. Jesus died. Jesus was buried. Jesus rose. Shabir tries to argue that crucifixion is an ambiguous term. He compares it to the word hanging in English. And sure, technically words can have different meanings, but in the context of 1st century Roman Palestine, crucifixion meant one thing. It meant being nailed to a cross and left to die. Everyone knew what it meant. There was no ambiguity to the people who witnessed it. This is what happens when you try to deny clear historical evidence. You have to start playing word games. You have to find obscure interpretations. You have to appeal to hypothetical scenarios that have zero historical support. Meanwhile, the Christian position just sits there with mountains of evidence from Christian, Jewish, and Roman sources all confirming the same basic facts. Jesus of Nazareth was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and his followers claimed he rose from the dead. So, what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.